let's talk about Socrates. So Socrates, now in the order of things, we talked about Heraclitus, and then after Heraclitus came Protagoras, and then you have Socrates. And then the student of Socrates is, one of the main students of Socrates is Plato. Many people don't know that. So Plato was a student of Socrates. Now, did you know that we don't have any books from Socrates? So we can't necessarily go into the library. Now, the amount of resources that we do have for some of these ancient philosophers is not a whole lot. I think if I'm not mistaken, Plato, we have 16 copies. I could be mistaken, but my mind serves me right. We have about 16 manuscripts of Plato. And we have more of Aristotle, but with it comes Socrates, we don't have any books. And the reason being, the majority of what we know about Socrates, again, comes from Plato, and doesn't have a lot of things written down, but we do know about him through, again, his student, Plato. So who was he? Let's look at our sheet here. Succinctly stated, he was a philosopher who believed that asking honest questions and examining life is the path of wisdom and virtue. He was a questioner, okay? Now, I want us just to note right now, questions are extremely, extremely powerful, okay? More powerful than we might think. Asking a question can get you in a lot of trouble, okay? Maybe you can recall with talking to a parent or maybe a person of authority, why do we do that this way? And they get frustrated and they say, just because we do, right? You see how interrogating the question can be? Okay? So succinctly stated, he's a philosopher who believed that asking honest questions and examining life is the path of wisdom and virtue. That is to say, Socrates spent his life challenging people to think more deeply about what they claim to know. This doesn't seem too controversial though, right? So at the very surface, it's like, well, okay, what's the problem with that? We thought that questions are good, right? We always hear that all the time. No question is a bad question. It's, let me just go on a tangent. There is such a thing as bad questions. Some people say, you can ask any question, there's no such thing as bad questions. I'm like, no, that's wrong. There are bad questions. There's actually very stupid questions, to be very blunt. So there's good questions and there's bad questions. So that's not true. So there are bad questions. Sometimes bad questions, well, a bad question is going to lead to what? Many times bad answers, okay? So, but in of itself, asking an honest question doesn't seem too controversial, but don't be deceived. Questions can be dangerous. Socrates was put to death for actually what was called impiety and the corruption of the youth of his day. That was his official charges, that he was impious towards the gods, the pagan gods, okay? So he's put to death for his impiety towards the gods and for corrupting the youth of the day. He was sentenced to drink hemlock and accepted this sentence rather than flee. Most scholars agree that the legal charges do not tell the whole story, though. And so here's what's kind of beneath the surface. What's the issue beneath the issue? I've heard it said before, the issue is not the issue. And in the case with Socrates, the issue is not the issue. What was really the issue at play, as according to most scholars, is he dared to publicly question politicians, poets, and respected citizens of Athens, often exposing their ignorance. And so, in a nutshell, he threatened the power structure by daring to question it. Okay? So the catch-22 is he asked questions of politicians, poets, and respected citizens. And these are questions, obviously, that expose their ignorance, their false assumptions. And so, what do? Sentence them to death. Okay? All right, any questions on that? Any questions on that? Get that? All right. Okay. So, let's talk about wisdom and foolishness. According to Socrates, wisdom is found in understanding one's own ignorance, knowing one's limits. He claimed that wisdom consisted in recognizing how little one knows. And so Socrates would typically only converse with those who had a certain character. If a person cared more about their reputation, their wealth, or winning an argument, well, Socrates would not engage but leave them alone. On a pause there, I have found that to be very, very valuable in life. There are some individuals like you'll maybe encounter online, and I learned this a while back. Most people online are not interested in a conversation, and so it's not worth debating. I've had conversations with other pastors saying, don't engage. Don't engage, it is not worth your time. And you can see it by the character of the person asking the question. Some people just want to have what? A good fight. Some people just want to prove themselves right. They're not interested in truth. Okay? So for Socrates, he would know his own limits, and he'd also recognize in other people if they knew their own limits. And if they knew their own limits, then he would say that would be an opportunity to actually have a conversation. But if they did not know their limits, if they were more interested in their what? Their own reputation, their wealth, or winning an argument, well, not worth it. I think it's a very, very wise, very, very valuable thing for us as Christians to ponder. Jesus alludes to this. I'm going to paraphrase Jesus. When you go into a city, if they don't listen, you what? Dust yourself off. And you go to somebody else that will listen, right? Okay? So, Socrates would not engage, but leave them alone. For Socrates, a person should just be as happy. This is huge here. For Socrates, a person should be just as happy to admit that they are wrong as that when they are right. To admit that you are wrong is great because it is a way to escape a great evil. Ecclesiastes hits on this. Proverbs hits on this. This is right in line with the literature of the Old Testament in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. Okay? And so if you think of it from this perspective, if you are wrong and you realize that you're wrong, the response should be, God be praised, right? Oh my goodness, I was wrong. And then you actually can learn what is right. And so think of it this way. If you're wrong, not only are you wrong, but you're also not right. It's like a simple to hear. I mean, just it's really simple what I just said, but just ponder that for a moment. If you're wrong, you don't have truth. So number one, you don't have truth and you have something else. So you're in a sense almost like doubly damned, right? So you're like -2. You don't have truth and you have an error. So you have your -2. But if you realize that you're wrong, okay, that's number one. If you realize you're wrong, then you're only what? -1. Then you're not wrong. And then that opens, if you're wrong, then you realize you're wrong, then it opens up the idea that you can actually understand what true is. Then you can actually be up to. That makes sense? Maybe a little bit of the tangent in the ditch. I find that it's better if you don't know, just to say you don't know. And if you try to fib and give a wrong answer, well then you're what? You're down one, right? Now you're not even speaking the truth, but you've actually spoken error. So I found it's just better to say I don't know, right? Make sense? So wisdom is in foolishness in a sense of knowing one's limitation, to knowing the extent of your abilities and your understanding of things. And that is just really, when it comes down to it, that's just common sense humility. Okay? Common sense humility. Okay, any questions so far on that? Okay, now I want to focus the remainder of our time what's called in Socrates dialectic. Socrates dialectic. One of the things Socrates was most known for was his dialectic. This was a method of learning through conversation and questions. Simply put, Socrates would ask questions, letting the other person do most of the talking while keeping the conversation on course. So in essence, he would ask questions, and the questions he would ask, and I'm going to summarize, he would ask questions. By asking questions, then the other person would be doing the majority of the talking, but their talking was being shaped and formed by what? By his questions. So who in essence was in control of the conversation? Socrates was. So he was, yes, we often think that the person who talks the most is in control of the conversation, unless they're being guided by questions. And then the person who's asking the questions is actually in control of the conversation. Just a little side note, I learned this as a pastor many, many years ago. Now, is this cruel? No, it's actually not cruel. This is good. This is Eighth Commandment stuff here. I have found as a pastor, interacting with literally hundreds of people over the years, there's some individuals who are just fascinating. You just let them talk, and it's just fun to listen to. There are some individuals who it's very, very tough to listen to. And we know that. We have family members, we have acquaintances and neighbors who, when they talk, it's just kind of very, very tough. But I realized if they're talking and I find myself almost maybe, either falling asleep or losing track, all you have to do is ask questions that are interesting to you, and you draw information out from them, and you can actually learn something. And then they're engaged, they're excited, and you're engaged. For example, if Socrates wanted to talk about courage, for example, he would ask a person about courage, okay? And then after the other person would talk about courage, Socrates would ask for a fuller definition of the word courage. And if a flawed definition was offered, Socrates would ask another question to help the person understand that their original definition was flawed. Here's an example. Person: courage is never being afraid. So the person asserts in a conversation, courage is never being afraid. Socrates: here's a question. So are soldiers who fear but still fight courageous? The person responds, you raise a good point. Maybe we should redefine courage. Socrates: yes, let's try to figure out how to define courage. How could we redefine courage? See how that worked there? It is not, notice how he asks questions instead of saying, courage is never being afraid. Really? I think you're wrong. You see, then right away, you have conflict. But are soldiers who fear but still fight courageous? You raise a good point. Maybe we should redefine. Yeah, maybe we should. What do you think it is? Ask questions by leading. So the goal of Socrates' dialectic is not to win an argument, but to expose unclear thinking, to challenge bad assumptions, and become wiser with another person. Indeed, his dialectic was not so much a way to win as to identify errors and promote the discovery of truth. That makes sense? I have used in apologetics, and I've actually taught this here at St. Paul's, and let's just do a quick review. We have enough time here, so let me take about 4 minutes to review this. There are about 3 questions you can ask that go in the spirit of Socrates that are very, very helpful. Question number 1. Okay, ready for this? Question number 1. What do you mean by that? Can you explain it in different words? I do that all the time. And it's just like, help me understand that. Okay? What do you mean by that? And you can ask that very, very genuinely. And it's not a gotcha question. It's just like, help me understand. How would you explain different words? And you'll learn real quick whether or not the person is just repeating a talking point of culture or they've actually thought it through. I have found that when I've asked that question with people who make a real bold assertion, I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. What do you mean by that? Help me understand that. And then I'll get this, well, I'm like, well, no, I don't. That's why I asked, help me understand. Well, no. How do you explain it? You can learn real quickly whether or not they're just parroting a talking point from a group of friends or a talking point from culture or something else, or if they've actually taken the mental energy to think it through and process it. Okay? That makes sense? Question number 2. That is fascinating. I'd like to learn more about it. How did you learn that to be true? I mean, where can I read more about that? How can I learn that more to be true? Tell me about that. Where can I go online? Can I look in a paper? Can I look in a textbook? How do I know that to be true? Okay. Question number 3. Are you 100% sure you're right, or could there be another explanation? Could there be another possibility? Last one, Socrates and the Logos. Now, we've been hitting the Logos. We hit the Logos with Heraclitus. We hit the Logos with Protagoras. So let's look at Socrates and his relationship to the Logos. Now, it may seem that with his questions, Socrates was a deconstructionist. Again, we talked about the deconstructionists. That's the sophists. They would tearing things down. So it would seem that he's a deconstructionist, but this is not the case. Socrates' ethical questions were directed at discovering universal and constant norms. So he was concerned with the universal fixed concept and definitions. Unlike the sophists who upheld relativistic views of morals, ethics, and truth, Socrates held that universal concepts remained the same. And so his style of dialectics was aimed at discovering the universal and objective norm. Sure, Socrates would say, there are imperfect and changeable objects of our everyday experience, but those changeable and imperfect things of our everyday experience are different than the universal concepts and reality that men could stand upon. So in a word, he saw the sophists and their relativism as a changing sea with no sure rock on which man could stand. Okay? And this is going to be consistent with Plato and Aristotle reacting to the sophists. And we covered this last week. If mankind is the measure of all things, and the measure of all things, what is true and what is not, if that's dependent upon a people group, a time, a culture, so forth, always changing, then that erodes language itself. And if you do not have language, you cannot communicate, and a society cannot stand. Relativism does not work. It will not last the test of time. Pragmatically speaking, practically speaking, it just does not work. That makes sense?